Good morning. I'm Andy McCoy, and I'd like to welcome you to today's presentation, Does God Care About the Oxford Comma? A Christian Perspective on Language Studies. We have a lot of adjudicators here about this today, so I'd like to welcome you. This is Dr. Kristin VanEyk. She participated this summer in the Continuum Scholars Program, and as a part of that program, she wrote a vocational bio, some of which I would like to read to you now. Kristin has been a Christian educator for her entire career, first as a high school English teacher, and now as an English professor with a PhD in English and Education from the University of Michigan. But she's been a Christian educator much longer, or rather she's been in Christian education much longer, having attended Christian schools as a child. It was this education that encouraged her to pursue the most important questions. Who are we? What are we supposed to do? And why does any of this matter? As a teacher of future English teachers, Kristin tries to help her students think about their future students from a worldview that centers the image of God as the reason why we should teach and learn. If we're going to point our toes in any direction, and if we're going to nudge anyone else's toes along the way, shouldn't it be towards generosity, creativity, and continuous study of who we are, what we are supposed to do, and why any of this matters? She's grateful to the many people who have influenced her faith and educational journey, especially the teachers and pastors who have walked alongside her and her spouse who continues to live a shared story with her. When Kristin looks back over the first 40 years of her life, she sees undoubtedly God's faithfulness to her. The poet Mary Oliver asks the question this way: tell me what it is you plan to do with your one wild and precious life. To Mary Oliver, Kristin says this. And that beautiful introduction, I think, serves as a way of highlighting that one of our goals, big goals with the Continuum Scholars Program, is to give faculty the opportunity to think about the work and research they do as a scholar in the context of the Christian liberal arts. And today I'd like to welcome Dr. Kristin VanEyk.
So, sorry, I have to go back. Okay, this all matters a great deal to me, an English teacher, because as a language authority, I wish to tell you that one version of a language is not more authoritative than another. So if I, as your English teacher, were to correct your British spelling of the word color and remove the U, you could ask me why Americans took the U out of color but kept the U in the word glamour. Some say it's because Noah Webster missed the word entirely when he created his first dictionary in the late 1800s, and so there was no official codification of the spelling until it was too late. Everybody was already in the US using the British spelling of the word glamour. This is the subject of a recent SNL skit. So there's a comedian named Nate Bargatze, and he plays General Washington, and it's in the middle of the Revolutionary War, and he goes out to meet some men who are out in the field, and he's going to cast a dream for why it is that the Americans were fighting for freedom from the British, So he's like, to establish our own laws and our own rules, to have freedom, and he says, and also to establish our own system of weights and measures. And all the soldiers are like, weights and measures, sir? He's like, oh yes, I dream of a nation where we use, Fahrenheit instead of Celsius and inches instead of centimeters. And then there's the scene where he says, one day, if we're brave, we'll get rid of the U in a lot of British words like color. And he says, but by God, we will keep the British U in the word glamour, right? Yeah. So the point is that there are many language preferences that vary by geography. The official English grammar rules have changed significantly over time. You can watch the word whom have its slow and gentle demise currently, right? So whether you or I follow the rules or don't follow them is really of little moral consequence, though it is and always has been of significant material consequence. Why? Because we've been socialized to ascribe value to people based on whether they adhere to language standards. So if I ask you what smart sounds like, can you hear something in your mind? What kinds of things would an educated person say? What would they talk about it? Where are they? What about poor people? Do they sound a certain way to you in your mind? What does the villain in a blockbuster movie sound like to you? Do they have an American accent? Are they male or female? If I say bumbling fool or something truly offensive like backwards hillbilly, can you hear the sound of a voice in your mind? Where do those associations come from? That's what I research. So we happen to know that God is a big fan of diversity, including linguistic diversity. I wasn't really one to question much when I was back in high school. And so when I started my education degree at Calvin College in 2001, I enrolled in a sociolinguistics course with a professor named Bill VanEyk. And he asked me a lot of questions about language that I'd never thought to ask before. For example, he asked me whether I thought it was classist to insist on standardized English in school. He wanted me to think about whether kids who speak different languages at home should have to pass standardized tests in English at school. And he wanted to know why multilingualism, which is the ability to do more, is seen by some as a deficit. So VanEyk assigned this book by two Calvin professors, David Smith and Barbara Carville, titled The Gift of the Stranger. And the first chapter of this book changed my perspective on God and language studies by challenging me to think about where my beliefs about language correctness come from and what God might think about those beliefs. Smith and Carville argued that God prefers diversity and that he's demonstrated this preference by acting accordingly throughout the Bible. For example, we know that when people disobeyed and tried to come together in one language in one place to build this tower to the heavens, that God acted to diversify their languages as a tool to send them out once more to do what they were supposed to do, which was fill the earth. We also know that people have been judging the language use of others since Bible times. We get our word shibboleth from the Bible. A shibboleth is a gatekeeper. It's a linguistic or a social or a cultural barrier that allows some to pass and keeps others out. The story of the word shibboleth comes from the book of Judges. The Gileadites and the Ephraimites, they're fighting, and the Gileadites take control of a crossing of the Jordan River into Ephraim. And the Gileadites want to figure out who's from Gilead, who's from Ephraim. Only the Gileadites can pass. So whenever someone came to cross the river, the Gileadites would say the word shibboleth, knowing that the Ephraimites would pronounce it sibboleth. So anyone who said sibboleth was slain on the spot. 42,000 Ephraimite men failed the linguistic test, and they were murdered in what amounts to an ethnic cleansing. So you and I are unlikely to enact a genocide over people's pronunciation, but too often we do allow language to be used as a shibboleth. We deny people's entrance into college. We judge people's fitness for performing a job. We refuse to take someone's ideas seriously because of how they use language. Many people have beliefs about language correctness that they've acquired through school from their English teachers and other school experiences. They may even believe that one's grasp of traditional American English grammar is a matter of intelligence or morality. Last year, I co-authored an article for a journal called Daedalus, which is the journal of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. And because it's a very important and scholarly article that publishes only the very best ideas, our article was filled with, memes. So here's a couple of them. So when you use bad grammar, it kills me again, right? Here's what it says: bad grammar makes me sick. This comes from a Facebook group that's titled this. There's a whole group of people on Facebook who they post people's mistakes and then laugh about them in the comments together. It's a very positive place, I'm sure. So I co-authored this article with 3 linguists who are people who study language, and one of our arguments is that some Americans have so internalized their beliefs about the use of traditional grammar that when they see or hear a misuse of grammar, they have an embodied reaction. They cringe, they roll their eyes, they feel sick to their stomachs. This anguished English for them is so repulsive that they may even believe that the language offender is less intelligent or less deserving of our time. Now imagine if English teachers behaved like this, purely hypothetical, of course. So imagine if I, as a teacher of future English teachers, trained all those future teachers to go forth and to pass judgment on students' language, to laugh at them in the teacher's lounge, to post images of their writing to Facebook, to submit them to Richard Lederer's books. What if I taught them to grimace in disgust at a dangling modifier, to roll their eyes at hopefully use as a sentence adverb at the beginning of a sentence, to convulse just a little when passive voice was slipped into by a student writer, to nastily object to a split infinitive? You get the idea. So what's the point? So I've been a Christian and an English teacher in that order since 2006, when I started teaching English at Grand Rapids Christian High School. Because I'm a Christian first, I must understand who people are from a particular biblical worldview before I think about what people do or ought to do with language or with anything else. So a little bit about me. I was born in Seoul, South Korea in 1983, and I'll save you the math, I'm 40 years old. I was adopted when I was 4 months old. At the time, Bethany Christian Services in Grand Rapids had a relationship with Holt's Orphanage in Seoul, South Korea, and so a whole bunch of Korean babies came to Grand Rapids, Michigan. So I grew up in a Dutch Christian Reformed family in Grand Rapids. I attended Grand Rapids Christian High School and later Calvin College. I got married immediately after college. That's what Christian girls did at the time. And I started teaching English. So all of that is true. It's also true that my parents divorced before I turned 2. My adoptive mother suffered from significant mental health disorders. I can remember a few instances when I was aware of her anxiety, her depression. She had what we would now call dissociative identity disorder. She would leave notes for herself. She would misplace something and then call the police because she couldn't find something, right? So I didn't know those terms as a child, but I can remember now stories of these things happening. She moved to California when I was about 6, so I lived with my dad, who was a single dad, for my entire childhood until I moved to Calvin for college. I wrote a little bit about this experience and how it shaped me to be a writer and a teacher of writers in an essay that was published a few years ago. It's called What Women Write. So if you have 2 parents, or 3, or I think I have 4 parents now with my in-laws, and I've got a mother-in-law, right? You know that every parent has a significant influence over your thoughts and behaviors. As a child, I had one parent, and he was a Dutch Calvinist, which means something to some of you. He was one of 5 sons of a Christian Reformed pastor, and he had attended Christian schools for his whole life. So as a result, he had and still has a particular worldview, especially when it comes to who people are and why any of this matters. So he, in conjunction with the Christian schools I attended and my childhood church called Eastern Avenue Christian Reformed Church, they passed this worldview on to me. There are 3 essential elements of this worldview. And I was not very reflective, I don't think, as a child. I sort of just absorbed all of this without really thinking it through. But it has sort of become a part of me now. So these 3 parts are this. First, the Kuyperian belief that our God is Lord over every square inch of creation. This includes you and me, our relationships, how we think about our money, our time, our food, our thoughts, our behaviors. So God is Lord over all of that. In the language of my dad, it would behoove me, it would behoove us to remember that the Lord our God has sovereignty, right? 2, I was taught that people are created in the image of God. So if I dishonor a person's humanity, I dishonor God. As a child, I understood that if I made fun of how someone looks or talks or behaves, I was mocking the image of God. And this is a sin, like serious sin. And 3, as a Reformed person, I was also taught that my faith life and my regular life were to be fully integrated as much as a sinful person can integrate the 2. So Sunday should have a direct impact on Monday. I should live my 9 to 5, my family life, pursue my hobbies, all as a person created in God's image, who is here to glorify God and anybody? Enjoy him forever. Thank you. Some of you had to go to catechism as a child, and it shows. So I should be doing that now and also in my day-to-day life. So when I became a teacher whose job it is to teach grammar conventions and evaluate students' ideas in their speech and their writing, I always thought about myself as a Christian first and a teacher second, and that I ought to integrate the 2 as fully as I can with my primary task to glorify God. So as is true in many aspects of Christian life, motivation plays a significant role in a Christian perspective on teaching English, on language studies, on whatever it is that you do. So it's my responsibility to teach students how the American English language works in a way that glorifies God and respects God's creativity and his order. So God is a God of rules, of order, of commandments. He's also a God of creativity, of table flipping, and questioning the motivation of authority. In my current church, we have a saying that oversimplifies the tension between the rules and generosity a bit, but we say, you are more important than my view. So on matters that are not of eternal significance, and I don't think a question of whether we should correct a Southerner's double modal, or how we should think about a word ask pronounced as ax, I don't think these are matters of eternal significance, then you should be more important than my view of language correctness. Church has always played a significant role in my vocational development. I grew up in a church that was part of a conservative denomination, the Christian Reformed Church. And my church was and still is constantly under threat of church discipline for its progressive views, at least as progressive as you can get within the Christian Reformed Church. So my church was founded in 1879. It split many times over many social disagreements. Significantly, I was one of the first kids in the Christian Reformed Church to grow up with a woman as the senior pastor. That pastor's name is Mary Hulse. She's currently the university pastor at Calvin College. She nurtured my faith and my curiosity, my intellectualism. When she left our church to pursue her own PhD, she continued to mentor me as I became more certain that I would also pursue a PhD. Church continues to play a significant role in my vocational development. My husband, Dirk, is a pastor. He's also a church planter. So we started a church called Encounter Church in 2010. We didn't know a lot about starting a church. Along the way, we've learned a lot about humility and generosity and grace. We've made some really big mistakes, and people have stayed with us. We've had some big losses, and people have encouraged us. There's also a lot of behind-the-scenes realities for pastors and their families that people don't really talk about. I don't think people who see me or meet me think, oh, she's definitely a pastor's wife. I don't have that vibe. Is that the right word? I don't know. So I don't know exactly what a pastor's wife is supposed to be, but I am grateful most Sundays that we started this kind of church because this is my daily work. This is why I stay in Christian education. None of us is impervious from being far from God, so it's good to be in a community that regularly, weekly, brings us back to God. Encounter Church has significantly impacted the relationship between my faith and my vocation. There have been times that I've resented the church for keeping us in Grand Rapids. There's been times that I have resented the church for keeping me employed. For the first 6 years after we started Encounter Church, I taught high school English in part to pay the church's bills, which is actually my husband's salary. It was the most significant part of our church's bills. I was in graduate school at the time, earning a master's degree in educational leadership. I was teaching full-time. We had small kids. I was coaching girls lacrosse for some reason. I was in charge of the school newspaper. I was very tired, but I couldn't quit because we had bills to pay. I also thought, and this was a sinful thought, that my meager income, I think I made $34,000 or something, but I thought that it was much more significant than it actually was. That I was making this great sacrifice so that my husband could pursue his dreams of being a church planter. The reality is, I think it was God's grace to me because it kept me in the field of education, and then it eventually sent me out to do my PhD in English and education. The health of the church is what finally allowed me in 2016 to quit my job as a high school English teacher and to go pursue that PhD in English education. I had a bit of an unusual graduate experience. I commuted from Grand Rapids to Ann Arbor most Mondays to Thursdays, occasionally on Fridays, for about 3 years. It's a 2-hour drive, and then you park at a commuter lot, and then you get on a bus which takes you to campus, and then I did my campus things, and then back to the bus, and then a 2-hour drive back home every single day. And as you can imagine, some resentment, right? Like, why can't we move to Ann Arbor? Why do I have to live like this? But one of the most important lessons that I learned through starting a church and staying in that church is that Christians have a common enemy, and it's sin. It's sin that prompts us to think untrue thoughts about ourselves and others. It's sin that drives wedges between us. It's sin that tried to convince me that my family obligations were holding me back from being the renowned academic I just knew I could be. It was sin that told me that the church was preventing me from living in Ann Arbor where I could be successful and intellectual and influential. With the gift of hindsight, I can see now that commuting between places kept them both in their rightful place. Neither the church nor the university, my family nor my intellect could ascend to the highest place, and that balance in my life is more evidence of God's goodness to me. So these are my church's 5 value statements. And while these are meant to guide my church as an organization, they also guide the church as a group of people. And I find that doing these 5 things helps me to be a Christian first, and then a mother, a wife, a teacher, a speaker, a writer, a friend, etc. second. Okay, I'm going to attempt to tie this all together for us and to find out whether or not God cares about the Oxford comma. So, I think God does care about the Oxford comma. So when you've got items in a list, you separate them by commas, and the Oxford comma is the optional comma at the very end of items in a list, right? So God cares about the Oxford comma because he cares about clarity when it comes to whether you are attacked by 2 dogs, a shepherd, and a boxer, or 2 dogs, a shepherd, and a boxer, right? He cares about my friend Bob, who, true story, at a restaurant ordered a water, a margarita, and a Diet Coke. And he was served a water and then a margarita mixed with a Diet Coke. So God probably does not want anyone drinking whatever is in Diet Coke. certainly not when it's mixed with whatever is in a margarita. And he gave you that good gut bacteria, but he did not ask you to test the limits with a Diet Coke and a margarita. So God cares about order, but he cares more about people. He cares when people are mistreated and misjudged because of the way they use or don't use language. He cares about the judgments that you or I make about someone based on their pronunciation of ask. God cares about whether you or I stand up to this kind of injustice or just let it go when we encounter it. So as an English teacher, I try to counteract this social injustice in 2 ways. First, I work with my students to help them think more critically about where their language attitudes come from and whether those attitudes should be challenged. And then second, I work with students to help them acquire fluency in standardized American English, including the Oxford comma, in case they wish to use that dialect in their speech or in their writing. So do I think students should have to use standard English grammar to be taken seriously and be given opportunities? Of course not. Will students need to know the grammar rules because sin is pervasive and it tempts others to judge people to believe that language correctness signifies competence and intelligence? Yes. So the older I get, the less sure I am of most things I'm supposed to know. And the more I am convicted that I've got to take good care of the people I know for as long as I know them. This grounds my scholarship and faith as I seek to hold grace and truth in tension. I'm probably not very popular in language studies because few people want to live in what our college president has called the messy middle. Most language studies people want me to renounce the teaching of standard grammar as classist or elitist or racist, and to instead promote the truth that language standards are arbitrary and negotiable, and they're reified to maintain power among those already privileged by them. But my Christian faith compels me to take good care of my students by teaching them both how language preferences impact the least advantaged, and also by loading my students' toolboxes with the ability to use standardized grammar, to give them that option. It's a messy middle, one that recognizes the effects of sin on God's gift of language as a gift of both order and creativity. One of the greatest lessons I have learned from my dad is a respect for the historic Christian faith and for the Reformed tradition of integrating faith into life. I'm grateful for my church experiences that have taught me that I don't have to agree with everyone and everything in the Reformed tradition to claim it for myself. I'm grateful for my years of teaching high school English at Grand Rapids Christian High, where I learned to talk about being a Christian with students. I'm grateful for my experiences at Calvin and the University of Michigan for connecting me with thoughtful people from very different ideological perspectives who sought the same justice through education and language studies, despite having very different motivations. And I'm very grateful for the many people here at Hope who have networked me into groups of thoughtful academics who care about what God thinks about a variety of topics, from how we eat to how we consume our media to how we judge people's language use. If we will all stop and pay attention, we will see that underneath the grammar rules or the meat on our plates or the reels in your DMs are beliefs that have been socialized and normalized by someone who is not us, though we have probably participated. If we pay attention, we'll learn that the question is not really about right or wrong, but, as linguist Deborah Cameron puts it, about who prescribes for whom, how, and for what purposes. If we pay attention to that question in our lives, we'll be more keenly aware of what it means to be a Christian and a teacher in that order, or a Christian and a mother, a Christian and a preacher, a Christian and a neurologist. What does God prescribe and why? What are other prescriptions in my life and where do they come from and why? When I pay attention to the beliefs of this world with Jesus as Lord over every square inch of it, I find a much clearer articulation of who God is, who I am, and what I'm supposed to be doing with my life. When I lead with a worldview that you are more important than my view, I remember to be a Christian first and everything else second, and to integrate the two as fully as I can with my primary task to glorify God. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. VanEyk. We have some moments now, certainly for questions, interactions with what you heard. Who would like to begin?
Hi, my name is Pablo Pesquera. This thing on? I was wondering how students have reacted to this. I often have students who welcome it meaning they can do anything, right? But you teach creative writing, they really think you can do whatever you want. And then other students who can't stand the idea because they have been so brainwashed by the visceral value of quote-unquote correct grammar, right? So how do students react to this?
They respond differently in different settings. So in English 113, I always start with a literacy narrative because I want students to think about how their language and identity are tied together, and also about all the messages they've received about language over the years, and about how their language that they use is somehow reflects something about them socially to other people. So they are interested in this idea, and they understand on an intellectual level that we shouldn't judge people based on the language that they use, right? Some of them are a little experimental, like our creative writers might be. And they'll try writing in blended languages, which I think is very interesting. And they're not writing that for me. I'm not the primary audience for that essay. And so I don't presume that I need to be the primary audience for that essay. And I think it's good for our students to have opportunities to write across languages and to think across languages. I bring multilingual texts into my English 113 class, and students they can't understand all the languages often. And it's a really interesting experience for them to become more aware of how they've expected in school that language is always used in a certain way. And so in English 113, I think they're also at the right place as they're mostly freshmen, some sophomores, just to be thinking about who I am, who I want to be, how I want to think about other people. And students are very much aware of how the world works. And so they understand that if they use language in a way that socially is perceived as lesser than, that's going to have implications for them. And so they often don't want to go out and experiment to try to get a job by using no punctuation on their job application, And so what we're trying to do is sort of nudge the ideology toward generosity, or toward the truth that language rules don't signify anything about the language user except for how well they adhere to this body of standardized language rules that we've established. And so they still want to learn standardized English. They want to know how to use it. But they're also very interested in what they can do with language. I teach a lot of future high school and middle school English teachers also. And so the question there is always, how do I grade student work when the grammar doesn't look the way I think it's supposed to look? Right? And that depends on so many factors. So if you've got students who are in your classrooms who are from a variety of other language backgrounds, they will eventually probably need to learn how the standardized English grammar rules work if they want to unlock some of those gates in the future. And so you can both tell them about how language ideologies function to keep people out or let people in, and that's an injustice. But they will also generally want to know how to write according to those standards, so they have the option of using that language in order to move through those gates. Then I always encourage them, once you're through the gate, what can you do to encourage a more generous ideology with those people who are beyond that gate that otherwise you couldn't have surpassed? I might put Andrew on the spot. Hi, Andrew. He's an English ed major. How do you feel about being a future teacher of students and having to evaluate their writing?
I definitely learned a lot from our class last semester together about talking about standard English and how we can serve our students best while also fighting against injustice and telling them. I think the thing that I took from that class the most was that you need to understand not only what your students are, what you're asking your students to do, but also why you're asking your students to do it and why it matters if they're writing the exact way you want them to write, or if they're writing to communicate an idea to you, a view, or like some point. So.
That's a great response. Thanks, Andrew. He's regretting coming here. He's like, this is the biggest mistake of my day. Should not have come here. He's in my next class too, so he's stuck with me for a long time today.
Others.
I like one of the things you said early on about how do it was a question, how do we see multiple linguistic competencies? I think you just said multilingualism, which, but particularly different versions of English competency? How do we see that as a strength rather than a limitation? I mean, I'm very monolingual when it comes to standard American academic English, which is a limitation, but it's not often seen that way. So I mean, and I think some of what you've already said helps move in that direction. But are there other ways we can sort of expand that?
Yeah, that's a good question. So you're all in classrooms, right? And often we use language, and we don't talk about the language we use that often. We just use language. We have conversations, we hand out readings. All of the handouts that we create for students are typically using the same dialect of English, right? This academic English. And we just circulate it as if it's the only language that they should expect to see, which reinforces and naturalizes beliefs about different kinds of languages in academic spaces. And academic spaces are also privileged spaces, right? And so we're associating now this kind of language that we use with privilege. And so if you ever have the opportunity in your classrooms, just sort of like peel back the layers, right? To help students think about their own language as one of many languages spoken in the world. If they speak English, they're a minority of English speakers are American English speakers. Around the world, English is spoken mostly not in American English ways, right? And then for them to just be more aware of that they have these attitudes that have been maintained and reified for them, like by this dominant bloc, right? To have them associate different kinds of lifestyles and values and beliefs with people's dialects. Some of them are racial or ethnic. Some of them have to do with social class. And our media does a really good job of associating character and caricature with language use. And so anytime students can just be more cognizant of that, it will help them. It'll really help them to like break through some of those barriers. My kids go to this really small Christian school, and every year the 7th graders do a play. And they did a play that was like a spin on a whole bunch of fairy tales. And so the big bad wolf was one of the characters. And we went to the play, and I was horrified to find that the big bad wolf spoke with a Russian or like an Eastern European accent as a 7th grader. And I don't think that anybody who helped those students prepare to put that play on ever questioned why that student took on an Eastern European accent when he played the lone villain in the play. But it was very unsettling for me. And so I brought it up. I'm on the school board, so I brought it up at a school board meeting, as one does. And no, like this, it just, everybody else, it just, like, they'd seen it, it seemed normal, it seemed natural. And he was kind of like a clumsy, like a little bit like bumbling as the villain also, or easily foiled. And we all just sort of like accepted it, like, oh yes, this is what a villain looks like, how they act, what they sound like. So there's like those moments, I think, are very teachable moments.
My initial reaction, Christian, is to say, "Amen, preach it, sister." And you've done a really wonderful job of couching this in terms of this controversy in terms of sensible judgment on other people. But I think also, and this is really a comment, not a question, that there's a raft of very practical reasons for teaching our students standard written English as well. I mean, let's face it, whether you like it or not, by and large, the language of international diplomacy is English. The language of air traffic control is English. Much medical work between speakers of different languages is done in English. You know, it's the language of NATO, all that sort of thing. And I think to not have our students be proficient in it is to do them a disservice. And I just wanted to add that comment to what you've been observing.
Yeah, I agree.
So I have an incredibly self-serving question. I really appreciated the perspective, and I think these are things we've talked about before, and that I've made an effort to try to bring these types of things in the past into writing classes. But I teach mostly literature classes, and I'm quite curious if you see a way to kind of bring some of this perspective, even though it's not as much about discrimination or about gatekeeping, into the resistance that students can feel with older forms of language. So like if I'm handing students a text from 200 years ago, there's often this, well, I'm having trouble, I don't understand it, and just a resistance to try to push past that sometimes. I mean, certainly not every student, right? But there's just often that kind of like, this is hard to read, and that's not right. It shouldn't be hard for me to read kind of attitude. So I didn't know if maybe you had some tips or thoughts about that.
That's a good question. It's not one that I've thought about as much. I would guess that Curtis has thought about this more. And Marla, can I punt to our experts in Middle and Victorian English? I haven't taught a lot of Shakespeare, just a little. But like I don't think I have an answer for you. I like to always like read the prologue for the Canterbury Tales out loud when we're getting ready to read in Middle English. And students think it's interesting to hear it, but then when they have to actually do the reading and the study and figure out what it means, you know, and what Zephyrius is and all this, it's hard. Yeah, Curtis might have a response.
Well, and just, text from 200 years ago is harder, although the Chaucer's a good example, because when I'm teaching how to pronounce Chaucer, I do like to pause and say, yeah, we don't really know what this sounded like. And there was no standard Middle English pronunciation or spelling. Didn't happen until you could have printing, and even then it didn't happen until basically the colonialist imperialist project was well underway, and projecting British status not only at home but abroad was a major concern, and language was one way to do it. So so there are, I mean, that's just an example of another place to note it. So sure, students have been schooled in how to pronounce Chaucer a certain way. But that's just something academics have made up over the years. We don't know.
That's true. Should we record that and play that for
We're
students?
asking to trust people in higher education more these days. Or just moving on. Did you have something you want to add?
Yeah. So, once again, my name is Pablo Pesquera. So you came to me. We were talking about Kaveh Akbar, and contemporary poet, and he often now doesn't use punctuation. And you were going to talk to, I think, with the Colley's classic Calvin. Oh, by the way, there's a poet and memoirist who's visiting February 20th, Shane McCrae, in his most recent book of poetry, almost no punctuation.
Okay.
So I'm wondering if you could talk about that as well. Like how do you help people work through that? My techniques in teaching creative writing may be different from how you have handled that.
How to help them write it or read it or both?
Read it.
How to read it.
Because to me it seems related to maybe something from 200, 300, 400 years ago.
Okay. Do you think there's a right and a wrong way? Like, can you tell what the author's intent is for where the meaning begins and ends in units, like semantic units within there?
Yeah, semantic chunking. Yeah.
Right.
I think if you read one poem, often just a page, you may not be sure. But when you read several poems, you begin to learn certain patterns, right? And I think that's the way to get at it, to learn the patterns of many texts. But that's also that resistance to hard work reading, right? That we get in all kinds of literature from all eras. And I was wondering how you handle reading hard things.
About your question of punctuation, I'm not an expert in how to read things that are manipulating the punctuation. I do talk with my students about how punctuation, why it matters so much. Have you all seen the Dear John letter? If you read it punctuated one way, it's a love letter, and if you read it punctuated the other way, she's breaking up with him, right? And it just matters where you put the periods and where your commas go. And so that often will surprise students because it's the same exact words in the same exact order, but the punctuation entirely changes the meaning. I don't know, Pablo. I don't know if I would. I think you're right that the more you read from a poet, the more you would understand how that poet tends to use language and how they tend to communicate ideas. And so what would make most sense based on what I've seen from this poet before and what I know about this poet's writing and the topics of their poetry. I think it's a very interesting conversation to have with students, to discuss with them, if the poet meant it this way, what does that mean? Or if the poet meant it this other way, what does that mean? And if the poet meant it both ways, what does that mean? And without punctuation, the meaning, you only have the relations of words to one another in order to decipher meaning. And so that in itself is also a meaningful experience of reading something, where you don't know where the meaning begins and ends within that text. I haven't taught a lot of work that uses or doesn't use punctuation in that way. So I don't have a very good answer for you. Yeah. It's the best I got. Deb?
Kristin, thanks so much. I have a comment and a question. Fun question. My comment is, I love that there's so many English professors and education people here, but it's like what you said, your comment earlier to Curtis is like language variation and think about language is what we all, like computer science professors and biology professors, because we are all making judgments about our students' language variation. And anyway, so I'm lamenting how this topic isn't necessarily on many people's radar. And even if I think about Michigan standards for teacher educators, language standards are only for English, future English teachers, and not for our biology and math. And I think it's just as important in those areas as well. So thinking about how to expand this conversation. My related question is, what are your favorite resources for people who want to dabble more into this, who maybe are never studied language before? Would you recommend fun books, TED Talks, etc.?
That's a good question. So April Baker Bell's book called Linguistic Justice was very popular for the past 2 or 3 years. And she writes a lot about Black English speakers and the use of Black English and how it's been used to signify identity and community, and also how what she would call, she's experienced anti-Blackness and how that's tied to language in ways that we might not think about because they've been so naturalized for us. And so that helps us just to think about someone's embodied experience of language and how it's come up against some societal expectations. Any book by Ann Curzan I like. She has some books about teaching. She has a book about how language works. She has a weekly show on Michigan Public Radio called That's What They Say. And people will just write in about observations that they've made about language. And she'll either go to the OED and find out what the etymology is of something, or why the word has moved in this direction, or why it is that the words are changing in the way that they're currently changing. So Ann Curzan is a good person there. Easy Writer. Oh, Easy Writer. Yeah. So Easy Writer is a book that every single English 113 student has. And if you want a copy, Dr. Tom Sura can get one to you. You can just let him know. And it contains a whole bunch of chapters about language variation, language preferences, and how to teach standardized English grammar within the context of linguistic diversity.
That Dr. VanEyk has contributed to.
Very briefly. Very briefly.
Yep, friends, we have more questions and probably much more conversation we need to have. It's been fantastic to have these department here having this conversation, but can we give Dr. VanEyk another round of applause?